I rejected my best friend for 12 years because I wasn't ready for something serious, but now that I'm 32 and he got with a 20-year-old girl and won't leave her for me. I have always believed that life is a series of strategic acquisitions, and Hugo was undoubtedly my most reliable long-term investment. We met when we were 20, both of us possessing the kind of pedigree that suggests a certain trajectory in life, but I knew I needed time to explore the market before settling. Hugo was the perfect legacy asset, loyal, remarkably well-educated, and hailing from a family whose name actually carries weight in the circles that matter. For 12 years, I kept him in what I like to call my private collection, allowing him to orbit my life while I curated a more vibrant, high-stakes existence for myself. It wasn't that I didn't value him, it was simply that a woman of my caliber needs to ensure she has seen the best the world has to offer before committing to a permanent fixture. Whenever Hugo would hint at something more, I would gently deploy my standard "I'm not ready" a protocol, which was essentially code for him to remain in the garage until I required a reliable ride. I spent my 20s and early 30s dating men who matched my social tax bracket: CEOs, architects, and the occasional polo player, because I understood that image is the primary currency of our world. Hugo never complained, serving as my steady +1 for the events that required substance rather than flash, always there to hold my coat or discuss international policy when the fun boyfriends proved too shallow. I assumed he understood the arrangement, as he was a man of taste and surely recognized that a woman like me is worth the wait. He was my safety net, a blue-chip stock I could cash in whenever the volatility of the dating market became too tiresome. Now that I have reached 32, I've decided it is finally time to activate my permanent lifestyle plan and settle into the refined domesticity I deserve. I've reached the peak of my career, my portfolio is healthy, and I am ready to transition from the it girl phase to the power couple era. Naturally, I looked to Hugo, expecting him to be standing exactly where I left him, ready to be polished and presented as my fiancé. It was the logical next step for both of us, a merger that had been 12 years in the making and would surely be the talk of our social circle. I had already begun mentally scouting venues for a summer wedding that would reflect our shared heritage and impeccable standing. To my absolute and utter disgust, however, I discovered that Hugo has been spending his time with a girl named Sophie. This girl is 20 years old, literally a child, and works at a juice bar, which I can only assume is some sort of low-level service job one does before realizing they have no future. She hasn't even finished a basic undergraduate degree, let alone mastered the nuances of the social grace required to stand beside a man like Hugo. When I first heard about her, I assumed it was a charity project or perhaps a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by a late-onset rebellious phase. I couldn't fathom that a man who grew up with the finest comforts would choose to spend his evenings with someone who probably thinks a vintage means something from 2015. I decided to be proactive and sat Hugo down for a civilized discussion to explain that while a gap year with a girl like that is an understandable distraction, it's time to return to his lane. I approached it with the grace and logic one uses when correcting a junior associate's mistake, laying out the facts of our shared history and social compatibility. I reminded him that I am now ready to give him the commitment he has pined for since we were university students. I expected a sigh of relief, perhaps an apology for his brief excursion into the lower classes, and a swift termination of his relationship with the waitress. Instead, he looked at me with a blank expression that I can only describe as a failure to grasp the gravity of his own situation. Then, in a display of sheer absurdity, Hugo actually laughed in my face and told me he's happy exactly where he is. He had the audacity to suggest that his time with Sophie is more fulfilling than the decade plus he spent waiting for me to curate my life. It was a staggering blow to common sense. He is literally choosing a girl who blends kale for a living over a woman with a master's degree and a sophisticated investment portfolio. He's behaving as if social capital and intellectual parity don't matter, which is a dangerous delusion for someone of his background. It felt like watching someone throw a Patek Philippe into a blender just to see what would happen. He tried to argue that Sophie sees him for who he is, which is the kind of hallmark sentimentality I would expect from someone who hasn't yet learned how the real world functions. I tried to explain that a partnership is a brand, not a campfire sing-along, and that Sophie is a glaring defect in his public image. He didn't seem to care, which makes me wonder if he's suffered some kind of quiet mental collapse under the pressure of his own potential. I've spent 12 years refining the space next to me for him, and he's filling it with someone who probably doesn't know the difference between a Bordeaux and a boxed wine. It's a total waste of a perfectly good legacy, and frankly, it feels like a personal insult to my own efforts. The sheer lack of gratitude is what stings the most. I have essentially been his mentor in taste and social navigation for over a decade. I've guided him through the right parties, introduced him to the right people, and kept him relevant even when he was drifting. To see him toss all of that aside for a whim is like watching a developer tear down a historic manor to build a prefabricated shack. He is making himself a laughingstock among our peers, and he's too blinded by some youthful spark to see the disaster unfolding. I find it incredibly unfair that my reward for finally being ready is to be passed over for a budget tier replacement. I've concluded that Hugo is simply going through a period of profound confusion, likely overwhelmed by the reality that the primary plan Himi is finally available. Some men panic when they finally get what they've always wanted, and they seek out as safe, unchallenging options like Sophie to avoid the responsibilities of a high-power relationship. She is a distraction, a human participation trophy for a man who is currently too afraid to win the actual prize. It's a tragic waste of his pedigree, and it's frankly embarrassing to watch him play house with a girl who hasn't even seen a tax return. He's choosing the path of least resistance, which is always the most unrefined choice a man can make. The more I think about it, the more I realize that Hugo is the one losing out here, even if he's too deluded to see it yet. I am a finished product, a woman of substance and status who has meticulously prepared herself for the role of a lifetime. He is trading a lifetime of prestige for a few months of fun with a girl who will be irrelevant the moment her youth begins to fade. It is a classic case of poor asset management, and I am simply the collateral damage of his midlife crisis. I will continue to hold my head high, because regardless of his choices, I remain the gold standard, while he is settling for a depreciating currency. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says, he's a human being with his own life, Beatrice, not a luxury SUV you left in a storage unit for 12 years. You can't just activate a people when you're bored of your other options. OP's reply, social compatibility is a science, not a hobby. Suggesting that a 12-year history with a peer is comparable to a whim with a juice bar employee is a biological error in logic. Anonymous user 2 says, maybe after a decade of you dating high-status men, he realized he'd rather be with someone who actually likes him instead of someone who views him as a LinkedIn endorsement. OP's reply, Sophie lacks texture and life experience. Hugo doesn't need a fan, he needs a partner who adds value to his social standing, which she clearly cannot do. Update 1. It's been 3 days since my last update, and I decided that the only way to resolve this was to show Hugo the staggering contrast between our world and his current hobby. I hosted a small, high-end dinner party at my penthouse, carefully selecting guests who embody the success and prestige Hugo used to value. I invited Hugo and explicitly told him he could bring his little friend, framing it as a charitable gesture to help her feel less out of place. My goal was simple, place Sophie in a room full of intellectual giants and social heavyweights so she could finally see the invisible wall she's trying to climb. I made sure the catering was impeccable, the kind of meal that requires a specific sequence of silver that I knew she wouldn't recognize. Throughout the evening, I meticulously steered the conversation toward topics like international tax law and the nostalgia of our shared childhood summers in the Hamptons. It was delightful to watch Sophie sit there in a stunned silence, looking increasingly confused as we debated the merits of various offshore trusts. She spent most of the night staring at her plate, probably wondering which fork to use for the poached pears, while the rest of us moved through the courses with effortless grace. I caught Hugo looking at her several times, but instead of the embarrassment I expected, he had this pathetic, protective expression on his face. It was as if he were guarding a stray puppy rather than enjoying the company of his social equals, which was incredibly grating to witness. Every time I tried to draw her into the conversation by asking her opinion on the European market, she would just blush and mention something about local community vibes. It was physically painful to hear such pedestrian language at my table, and I could see my other guests exchanging knowing glances behind their wine glasses. I felt a sense of duty to Hugo to highlight just how much of a babysitter he had become in this relationship. A man of his standing should be challenged by his partner, not forced to explain basic economic concepts over dinner. I made sure to be the perfect hostess, projecting a level of sophistication that I knew would make her feel like a thumb in a jewelry box. Once the other guests had departed and Sophie was predictably in the powder room trying to figure out how to use the monogram towels, I pulled Hugo aside for a private word. I told him quite frankly that it was embarrassing to watch him spend his evening tending to a guest who clearly lacked the cultural capital to be at a formal table. I reminded him that he owes it to his family name and his own hard-earned reputation to be with a woman who adds value to his life. I spoke with the kind of stern but loving authority a mentor uses when a student is about to fail a crucial exam. I told him he deserved someone who could lead a conversation, not someone who needs a tutor just to get through a 4-course meal. I expected him to finally crack, to admit that the evening had been a wake-up call and that Sophie was a mistake he was ready to rectify. I was prepared to be magnanimous about it, to offer him a graceful way out of his predicament without further social penalty. Instead, he didn't even argue with me, he simply stared at me with a look of cold detachment that I found incredibly disrespectful. He didn't say a word about my points or my generosity in hosting them, which shows how much his manners have slipped since he started seeing her. He waited for Sophie to emerge, took her hand as if she were some kind of prize, and left my home without even saying a proper goodbye. The sheer rudeness of his exit was a testament to how much Sophie has already corrupted his sense of propriety. I spent hours curating an environment designed to save him from himself, and he treated it like an inconvenience. It's clear that he's currently in a state of emotional arrested development, clinging to this girl because she makes him feel big, by comparison. He's choosing the comfort of a low-bar relationship over the challenge of a high-stakes partnership with me. It's a tragic regression, and I feel like I'm watching a valuable piece of art being left out in the rain to rot. I've spent the last few days reflecting on how ungrateful men can be when you try to protect their interests better than they do themselves. I provided Hugo with a master class in social reality, and he chose to ignore the syllabus entirely. It's not my fault that he's currently allergic to excellence, but it is my burden to watch him settle for mediocrity. I know that eventually, the novelty of teaching Sophie how the world works will wear off, and he'll realize he's just a high-end au pair. Until then, I suppose I have to accept that even the most stable investments can have a temporary dip in value. Despite his behavior, I remain convinced that I am the only one who truly understands what Hugo needs to thrive in the long term. Sophie is a temporary glitch in his programming, a result of him being left on the shelf for too long while I was busy building my own empire. He's just lashing out because he's hurt that I didn't activate him sooner, which is a very immature way to handle a strategic delay. I'm giving him the space to realize his error, but I won't be silent while he drags his family name through the mud at juice bar prices. He will eventually see that a woman of my caliber is a necessity, not an option he can simply decline. Update 1 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, he didn't leave because he's corrupted, Beatrice. He left because you spent an entire dinner party being a condescending nightmare to a girl who did nothing to you. OP's reply, I was being charitable by showing her how the 1% actually lives. It's a mercy to show someone their limits before they humiliate themselves on a larger stage. Anonymous user 2 says, the Hamptons and tax law? Are you trying to date him or audit him? No wonder he looks at her with a protective eyes, he's protecting her from you. OP's reply, love is a luxury built on a foundation of shared status and intellectual parity. Anything else is just a fleeting chemical reaction with no long-term ROI. Update 2. It's been 1 week since my last update, and Hugo has completely stopped answering my calls, which I find to be an incredibly cowardly way to handle a professional-grade disagreement. I've reached out multiple times to offer him a chance to apologize for his behavior at the dinner party, but he's clearly hiding behind his juice bar barricade. I found out through a mutual friend, someone who actually values my social standing, that he recently took Sophie to the high-profile gallery opening I've been eyeing for months. It was an event for the city's elite, the kind of place where your outfit speaks louder than your CV, and I knew I had to be there. I didn't go to follow them, obviously. I went to maintain my presence and ensure the brand of our social circle wasn't further tarnished by their appearance. When I arrived, it was even worse than I imagined. Sophie was wearing a dress that probably cost less than my shoes, laughing loudly and drawing far too much attention to herself. She was acting as if the art were something to be enjoyed rather than an asset to be appraised, which was frankly embarrassing for everyone in the room. I saw Hugo standing next to her, looking entirely too comfortable with her unrefined presence, as if he had forgotten everything I taught him about social decorum. I decided to intervene kindly, approaching them with the poised grace that only comes from years of being at the top of the food chain. I offered Sophie my card and suggested a high-end stylist and a finishing school I know that specializes in helping girls from her background integrate into polite society. I told Hugo, quite clearly, that he was making a spectacle of himself by parading a work in progress at such a professional and high-stakes event. I meant it as a helpful observation, the kind of feedback a friend gives when they see someone about to make a massive career-ending mistake. I expected Sophie to be grateful for the direction, as she clearly has no idea how to navigate a room like that without looking like a tourist. Instead, she just looked at the card with a puzzled expression, while Hugo finally spoke up with a tone that was shockingly aggressive. He told me that Sophie is the first person in over a decade who hasn't treated him like a backup plan or a legacy asset to be managed. The absurdity of his statement was almost too much to handle. I reminded him that I am the primary plan, and that he is simply experiencing a midlife crisis a bit early. I explained that Sophie is an unprocessed youth, a raw material that would take years of expensive labor to turn into something even remotely acceptable for his lifestyle. I told him that I was offering him a shortcut back to his true self, but he just shook his head and walked away from me again. It's as if he's developed a sudden allergy to maturity and refined taste, preferring the easy, unchallenging company of a girl who thinks a gallery opening is a fun date. He is literally devaluing his own social stock in real time, and he's doing it with a smile on his face. I spent the rest of the evening explaining to our mutual acquaintances that Hugo is currently mentoring a young woman, trying to save face for him since he clearly won't do it himself. It was exhausting to have to act as his PR manager while he was busy ignoring his own best interests right in front of me. I could see the pity in people's eyes, and I made sure they knew that I was still standing by him despite his temporary lapse in judgment. I am a woman of loyalty, and I won't let 12 years of curation go to waste just because he's having a flirtation with the working class. It's my responsibility to ensure he doesn't burn every bridge he has before he comes back to his senses. The sheer arrogance of him suggesting that I treated him as a backup plan is a total inversion of reality. I was protecting him for the right moment. He was the most important piece on my board, and you don't play your strongest piece in the opening moves of the game. I waited until the board was set, and now that I'm ready to make the winning move, he's trying to flip the table like a spoiled child. He doesn't seem to understand that Sophie doesn't see him, she just sees a man with resources who can give her a life she could never earn on her own. She's a social parasite, and he's the willing host, blinded by her unprocessed charms. I returned home feeling a mixture of frustration and a strange kind of maternal pity for how far he has fallen in just a few weeks. I've decided that my next move needs to be more analytical, as he's clearly stopped responding to emotional appeals or social logic. I need to show him the irrecitza of our relationship, the sheer volume of equity I've built in his life that he's currently trying to forfeit. He thinks he's free, but he doesn't realize he's just in a low-rent prison of his own making, and I'm the only one with the key to his former life. I won't let a 20-year-old with the community vibe destroy the empire I've been building for us since we were students. Update 2 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "You're 32 and calling a 20-year-old a work in progress while you're standing in a gallery alone and bitter. Who exactly is the finished product here?" OP's reply, "I defend my refined maturity over Sophie's unprocessed youth. Being finished means having the discernment to know what belongs in a gallery and what belongs in a juice bar." Anonymous user 2 says, "Offering a finishing school card? That was a straight-up villain move. You didn't do that to help her, you did it to humiliate her in front of him." OP's reply, "I call it social mentoring. If she intends to occupy space in Hugo's life, she needs to meet the minimum requirements of the role. I was merely providing the syllabus." Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since my last update, and since Hugo has chosen the path of silence, I decided to communicate in a language he used to respect, data. I spent several evenings compiling a detailed spreadsheet of our 12-year history, documenting every high-value connection I've provided and the emotional equity I've invested in him. I calculated the ROI of the networking events I hosted, the social doors I opened, and the sheer man-hours I spent curating his personality to fit my eventual lifestyle. I sent him this comprehensive audit of our relationship to prove that I am a blue-chip investment, whereas Sophie is a depreciating asset who will be entirely obsolete by the time she turns 25. I explained to him, in very clear terms, that a partnership with me is a strategic merger of 2 powerful brands, while his current situation is just a high-maintenance hobby. I pointed out that Sophie's lack of professional trajectory means she will eventually become a liability, a deadweight on his social and financial progress. I am a woman who scales, she is a girl who will eventually just be an older version of a juice bar employee. I felt it was my duty to show him the cold, hard numbers of his current, midlife crisis, before he completely liquidated his future. I included a section on the opportunity cost he's paying by not being with me, which I found to be particularly compelling. Along with the spreadsheet, I issued a formal ultimatum: he must drop the waitress and we will announce our engagement by the end of the month, or I will cut him out of my circle entirely. I made it clear that if he chooses to stay with her, he loses access to my network, my events, and the professional gloss I provide for his image. I expected him to panic at the thought of losing the Beatrice seal of approval, as he's always relied on my taste to validate his own. I was giving him the ultimate exit ramp from his mistake, a chance to regain his status and secure a future with the gold standard of partners. I truly believed he would see the efficiency of my proposal and come crawling back, perhaps with a formal apology and a high-end ring. I waited by my phone, expecting a call full of contrition and a request for a meeting to discuss the merger details. I had already begun drafting the press release for our social circle, framing his time with Sophie as a private research phase that had finally concluded. I was ready to be the bigger person and move forward as if this whole sordid affair had never happened. Instead of a response to my spreadsheet or a plea for forgiveness, I received something I never thought Hugo would have the spine to do. He didn't even type a reply, he simply sent me a screenshot of us blocked a notification on his end. The sheer audacity of being blocked after 12 years of social curation is a level of disrespect I didn't think he was capable of. It's a complete rejection of the emotional equity I've built, a refusal to acknowledge the staggering amount of work I put into making him a suitable partner for me. He's behaving as if the numbers don't matter, as if he can just block his way out of a 12-year contract of expectations. It's a staggering display of emotional immaturity, and it confirms my suspicion that Sophie has completely rotted his brain with her unprocessed nonsense. He's tossing away a blue-chip future for a girl who probably doesn't even know what a spreadsheet is. I spent the evening looking at my work, stunned that he could be so blind to the logic of his own life. I've done everything for him, and he's treating me like a telemarketer or a spam bot instead of the CEO of his future. I am convinced he's just posturing, trying to assert some kind of misguided dominance before he inevitably realizes he can't survive without my social oxygen. He's playing a dangerous game of chicken with his own reputation, and I'm the only one who can save him from the crash. He'll be back the moment he needs a proper date for a high-stakes event and realizes he has no one but a waitress to bring. I'm currently preparing for the upcoming gala, the biggest event of the season, and I know he'll be there. He won't be able to stay away from the center of the world, and I intend to be the most radiant thing in the room when he finally breaks down. I've already selected a gown that costs more than Sophie's annual salary, and I'll be surrounded by men who actually understand the value of a high-power partner. I'm giving him one last chance to witness the gold standard in person before I move on to a more appreciative investment. He's just experiencing a temporary system failure, and I am the only one who can reboot his life. Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, a spreadsheet? You sent the man a spreadsheet of emotional equity? Who does that to someone they supposedly care about? You're treating him like a hostile takeover, Beatrice. OP's reply, efficiency is the key to a successful marriage. If you can't quantify the value of a relationship, you're just wasting time on a hobby. Ideal in results, not a vibes. Anonymous user 2 says, you just handed him the exit key he's been waiting for 12 years. That a blocked notification wasn't a mistake, it was a celebration. OP's reply, he's just posturing. He'll crawl back the moment he realizes that a juice bar employee can't help him navigate a boardroom or a gala. I am a necessity he can't afford to lose. Update 4. It's been 1 month since my last update, and I showed up at the gala yesterday fully expecting Hugo to be there, miserable and alone, having finally realized the staggering cost of his mistake. I had spent weeks preparing my look, ensuring that every detail projected the power and status he was currently missing out on. I walked into the ballroom with the confidence of a woman who knows she is a primary plan, ready to accept his inevitable apology with a practiced, charitable smile. I had even prepared a short speech about the importance of returning to one's roots after a period of confusion, assuming he would be desperate for a way back into my good graces. I scanned the room for his familiar face, eager to see the look of regret I knew would be there the moment he saw me in my designer gown. He was there, but he wasn't alone, and the sight of him was a violent shock to my system. He had Sophie on his arm, and she wasn't wearing the budget-tier rags I expected. She was wearing a vintage gown that I later found out belonged to Hugo's grandmother. It was a piece I've dropped hints about wanting for over a decade, a legendary family heirloom that represents the very pedigree I've always valued in him. Seeing it on her on a girl who probably thinks heirloom is a type of tomato felt like a physical assault on my social standing. She looked radiant, and for the first time, she didn't look like a work in progress, she looked like she belonged there, which was the most infuriating part of all. I tried to maintain my composure, moving through the crowd to cut in and reclaim my space, but Hugo didn't even look at me as I approached. He was completely focused on her, laughing at something she said with a genuine warmth I haven't seen in him since we were 20. When I finally forced myself into their orbit, his mother, a woman I've cultivated as an ally for years, stepped between us with a polite, cold smile. She didn't welcome me with the usual warmth. Instead, she told me that the family has decided they prefer fresh energy now. She actually had the nerve to suggest that I should find someone more suited to my rigid requirements, effectively blacklisting me from the very legacy I thought I owned. I'm currently standing in my designer living room, surrounded by 12 years of notes, gifts, and a collateral I kept to ensure my hold on Hugo's life. I'm looking at the spreadsheet I sent him, and for the first time, the numbers don't seem to add up to anything but my own isolation. I've realized that I'm not the CEO of his life anymore. I'm just an outdated model that stayed on the shelf too long, waiting for a market that has moved on without me. I was so busy curating the perfect future that I forgot that people aren't assets you can just activate when the timing suits your portfolio. I've been replaced by something cheap that he values more than my entire pedigree, and the humiliation is as absolute as my status. I've lost my best friend, my safe husband, and my dignity, all because I thought I could own a person like a stock. I spent my life looking down on inferiors, like Sophie, only to find that she possesses the one thing I could never quantify, a genuine connection that doesn't require a spreadsheet. I am still the gold standard, I suppose, but I'm a currency that no one is buying anymore. I'm sitting here in my perfect apartment, with my perfect master's degree and my perfect investment portfolio, and I have never felt more like a depreciating asset in my entire life. The primary plan has failed, and I'm left with nothing but the texture of my own refined bitterness.